Hello, welcome everyone for what is our second Woolf Post-Kantian philosophy seminar. It's really good to see you all. Some other maybe trickling in as I sort of give some introductory remarks to say a bit about today's speaker, J. Aaron Simmons, professor of philosophy from Furman University. I'm sure if you're here today, you're very familiar with Aaron's work, but I'll say just a few things about it. Aaron is known, I think, primarily for two things. First, his work in phenomenology and also his work in Kierkegaard. He wrote a very important and influential work of phenomenology that he co-authored with Bruce Ellis Benson called The New Phenomenology. He's also the author of God and the Other, and he's edited a number of volumes, Kierkegaard and Levinas, Ethics, Politics, and Religion, and Kierkegaard's God and the Good Life. And I think more recently, another title as well called Christian Philosophy. And he's a former president of the Soren Kierkegaard Society. Today's talk is entitled, Why Are Existentialists So Miserable? Prospects for Finding Joy in a World Marked by Despair. And my understanding is that his talk today is related to some book material he's currently working on. So I'm sure he'll have something to say about that as well. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Aaron.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thanks to Zach behind the scenes, making everything run smoothly. It is genuinely my honor to be with you all today and look forward to a great conversation. Whenever I give talks, I'm always more excited about the conversation at the end than I am the talk, because I already know what I'm going to say, and I'm excited to hear what you all have to say back. So I'm looking forward to seeing where we go together and the kinds of things we can think about together today. So let me go ahead and dive in and pull up my presentation here so you all can see it. All right. So my title of the talk, Why Are Existentialists So Miserable? I should note that this was a title that was meant to be tongue-in-cheek. But as we'll see, it's something that it turns out lots of people take very seriously. So just in case Stephen needs something that sounds a little bit more fancy pants, here's an alternative title, Kierkegaard and Chrétien on Resources for Responding to Henri's Account of Barbarism. But to be honest, a few years ago, I decided to try my best never to write papers that were just names of other thinkers, but were actually speaking to ideas and issues. So that's not the title I went with. And today I want to make clear that in light of the pandemic, I think that something not really radically has changed, but a different emphasis maybe shows up relative to how we do philosophy. And I call it doing philosophy with masks on. So if you remember early days of the pandemic, they were saying, look, we're wearing masks not to protect ourselves, but to protect others. And the whole idea was we do this because we are in solidarity, because we are relationally engaged with the other person. I think philosophy fundamentally, especially in our current global malaise that we face, I really think we've got to start recognizing that when we do philosophy, it's not just something that we do for our own community, just for other academics, but it's something that we do maybe for the public good. And so today is going to be an attempt to do philosophy with a mask on, as it were. So here's my thesis, and I'm pulling from one of my favorite poets, a guy named Atticus. It's also the name of my son, but he did not write this. Here's my thesis. No, life isn't that bad. Just today. Today sucks. Today's the effing worst, but probably not tomorrow or even the next day. Yeah, the next day might be effing sweet. There's my thesis. Let's see how we can argue for it. So Heidegger says that it's important to get clear what we're bringing to the texts. And so in order to do that, here are some of my motivating concerns, the things that kind of set up the questions I'm going to be asking. One, I think we can all agree that largely philosophy is seen as useless in the real world and unhelpful for being successful. And this is the case even more broadly relative to the humanities, right? They're viewed as a threat to our way of life rather than a resource for living well. Now, all of the words or phrases in quotations are actual things I've been told and words that have been used by my students and their parents. when they, respond horrified that their daughter or son is excited about studying philosophy. And I'm told, no, this is a threat. This is not something they need to be doing. This is useless. They've got to do something practical. And the more and more I think about this, and the more I see philosophy departments trying to justify their existence by, appealing to the value theory of those parents, I think maybe what we need to do is recognize that we are failing to live the lives that we advocate for. And so rather than just thinking we need to write better books arguing for really technical work internal to Kierkegaardian, philosophy, which, believe me, I'm all in on, maybe we need to realize that we are modeling the relevance of philosophy the way we navigate our social lives. So here are the two questions that motivate my talk today. How might philosophers speak more effectively to our situation, right? Socially, culturally, politically, existentially, by modeling how to live rather than just thinking about life well lived. Now, this is not saying that we are somehow maximally virtuous or we get everything right, but in fact that we are probably really good at showing the messiness and admitting the vulnerability and navigating the stuff that for other people they just try to cover over. And I think this is something that we miss as one of our great values. And so how can post-Kantian philosophy in particular be a resource in doing that? Well, in order to get into this, I took seriously the idea that this is the public seminar in post-Kantian philosophy, which of course is a bit of a mouthful. And yet I think that it's got two things going on that we as philosophers need to think through in order to maybe live into this existential idea a little bit more effectively. First, in order to think about the public, and by the way, when I think about the public, I am desperately missing joining mosh pits. I haven't been to a legit metal concert in 3 years. And so the only image I could possibly use was of a dude crowd surfing. So I missed that public. But public hits in two ways, right? So a public seminar, I think, has to be directed to a public audience. And this means that we're not restricting our listeners or our readers to those who also know how to parse the German in Heidegger. Now, it's fine to have that audience in lots of spaces, but I think more and more philosophers need to think about public audiences and how they convey ideas. And secondly, we've got to have our content be of public relevance. In other words, it's something that is hitting us where we live regarding our shared lives together. And this was something that the pandemic, again, we found ourselves #alone together in this together. And it just made me think, wow, philosophers maybe can do a better job of how to think through that togetherness in ways that are productive. So what about post-Kantian philosophy? What do I mean when I talk about post-Kantianism? Now here, I fully expect some of my professional philosopher friends are going to take issue with the way I narrate this. And that's fine. That's what gives us job security, is that we can bicker amongst ourselves over very narrow things. But here's what I mean by post-Kantian. I'm taking seriously that his Copernican revolution in philosophy, as he calls it, is, and we all know this, it's a shift from a focus on the object to a focus on the self or the subject as the condition of experiencing the world the way that we do. So this is his project of transcendental idealism. What must be the case about my cognitive apparatus such that the experiences that I have are conditioned in order for me to have them? But I want to say that complicated idea is really just an emphasis on selfhood. It's asking the question at its most basic level, who am I? Now, he asks that question in a decidedly epistemic manner, but I don't think we have to limit it to that. And this is where his three big questions become so relevant. He says, what can I know? What must I do? And what may I hope? And my interest, of course, is not ignoring knowledge and action, but thinking more intentionally about this third idea. What may I hope? Because it doesn't obviously track relative to a particular philosophical disciplinary subspecialty. I think hope is, so who are we going to become? Right? Who is this we that we travel with? Who am I going to be in order to live toward it? So I want to focus on that last idea and suggest that Kant is actually calling our attention to the lived dynamics of thinking. Philosophy must be relevant to life, whether or not with all apologies to my students' parents, it's relevant to a particular job training program that they think is the point of college. And this is effectively why Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are so obviously post-Kantian philosophers. Kierkegaard says life's not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. Nietzsche suggests that life is not an argument. So if we read Kant in this way, which I'm calling existential, then it invites us to be phenomenologically responsible, taking seriously the way the world gives itself to us, and hermeneutically aware. How then are we charged with interpreting that givenness in particular ways that then let us be publicly engaged in really important existential ways? So that's my task. So here's my suggestion. The existential question, and I would suggest the only question of philosophy, is the question, what's worthy of my finitude? What will I then do with the life that I find myself having, that I find myself living? So to think that question through, I want to make sure that we don't confuse existential philosophy with existentialism as a really technical, historical, philosophical movement. Now, these certainly overlap. Lots of existential philosophy is done by existentialists in technical, historical ways. But when I'm talking about existential philosophy, and when I ask this question, are existentialists miserable? I'm not only or reductively thinking about Sartre and Beauvoir and Simone Weil and Dostoevsky. I'm thinking more about Snoopy sitting on top of his doghouse saying, where am I going? What's the point of all of this? I'm thinking about the fact that my son last night, he's turning 13 tomorrow, so I guess he's having a very early life crisis. Teenage years are hitting him hard. He's going to bed and he says, Dad, I have a question for you. I don't want to talk about it right now because I've got to go to sleep. But what's the point of living if we're just all going to die? Right? That question, I want to suggest, is more important than all of the volumes written by all of the philosophers, if they're not somehow going to respond to questions like that. So when I say existential, I'm not ignoring existentialists, but I'm thinking about this broader idea. So why are existentialists so miserable? Then is this question, people who think through these Snoopy questions, my son Atticus's question, why is it that they typically are not the life of the party, right? They tend to be pensive and, kind of turned in on themselves in ways that then we might say, wow, that's not super compelling. But I've got to say, when I posted that question, why are existentialists so miserable on Facebook, I thought this would be just again, kind of fun tongue-in-cheek way to get some funny answers I could share with you. And I got some. So one of my colleagues here at Furman said existentialists are miserable because their pants are too tight, which I thought was hilarious because then some of my other colleagues hopped in and a legitimate conversation emerged about maybe the benefits of tight pants, which I thought was exactly what philosophers are apt to do. One of the most interesting answers was that the existentialists are miserable because they pay attention. And I'm actually going to pursue that line in a minute. But what was interesting to me was the fact, and really kind of disappointing, was so many of my professional philosopher friends who work in existentialism in a technical way really got kind of angry at the question. It was, this is lazy stereotyping. This is such a straw man. I'm sick of this being the way that we're all presented. And then a bunch of charges that my own privilege was not attending to the fact that melancholy is not misery. And this just reflected the fact that I was unable to make sense of what was really going on in existentialism. Now, all of that's possible. Maybe, I am one of Augustine's dullards, as it were. But I actually think that their responses are revelatory. And it helps us say, we're not asking about the mental state of Simone de Beauvoir or Jean-Paul Sartre. I'm asking about, how is it that people engaging in existential philosophy navigate the world? It's like Maya Angelou says, when you're in a room, do people say, oh, I love her. That guy's so amazing. It makes the place better. Or when you walk in a room, do they say, oh, damn, like, man, who invited them? So it's that kind of question. It's not a historical question about the mental state or the depressive capacities of individuals. It's more about, what does doing existential philosophy indicate in the world? And so I want to change this question slightly. Does reading existential philosophy make you or your students more joyful? And the answer might be yes. I'm going to argue that it should. But I think in the vast majority of cases, it probably doesn't. I don't know if any of you have had the experience, but when I often teach existentialism in a technical sense to my students, I get lots of calls from students at 2 a.m., very depressive. And tragically, I've had a couple call me in suicidal moments because they just couldn't get out of that question they had hit in Camus or Kafka. And so in putting them in touch with the right resources to help them navigate some of that, I start thinking, wow, maybe what we're doing when we do existential philosophy needs to be self-reflective in a little bit more socially aware way. And so another way to ask this question is, does the presence of a bunch of continental philosophers make a gathering more enjoyable? Maybe it does, right? SPEP can be a lot of fun. But it's also the case where when you think about going to a party in college, do you want to make sure that you read, you invite all the philosophy majors? Or are you kind of worried that if you invite the philosophy majors to the party, maybe the party is going to suck a little bit more? So it's that low level at which I'm thinking, how does existential philosophy invigorate us? Or does it really invite us to joy, or maybe melancholic, maybe even misery? Well, Nietzsche, in fact, already was realizing the question, the issue that I'm raising. He says that one single joyless person is enough to create constant sullenness and dark skies for an entire household. And only a miracle can cause that one person to be lacking. Happiness is not nearly as contagious a disease. Why is that? I'm basically just asking Nietzsche's same question, just hoping to put it in a little bit more contemporary package. So I think there's a variety of possible explanations. Some of these are fairly standard. The themes of philosophical focus that existentially oriented philosophers undertake tend to be what Sartre calls the dark side of human life, right? And we could talk a variety of things here. We could say Seneca and Shakespeare and Camus all have really very closely narrated reflections on suicide. And not just saying this is horrible, we've got to move away from this, but saying, hey, Seneca in particular, I have to be real careful when I read Seneca with my students, because he's talking about freedom lying with the flick of a wrist and a sharp rock. So how do we think through these issues without sliding into some of these worries that Nietzsche and others have pointed out? Issues like absurdity, ambiguity, the radicality of freedom, where we end up feeling condemned by it. It's a weight, right? Nietzsche says about the death of God that it's as if we're falling through an infinite nothing. We wiped away the horizon. These are, again, not spaces that we think, woo, more of that, please. So how is it that we're able to make sense of this? One might be, well, it's just the stuff they talk about. It also might be that when we are existentially aware in reflective ways, it's often perceived as a social threat. We saw this with Socrates in front of the Athenian Senate. We see this now with conservative school boards worried about critical race theory. Whenever we ask questions that interrogate what we take for granted, it's going to be seen as a social threat. And when you're perceived as a social threat, it's often difficult to then navigate the world, right? Bopping along in joy and hope. So that might be what's going on. And third, and again, I'm not really being sarcastic here, maybe melancholy is part of the job security for philosophers. We need to seem a particular way. We need to seem deep and pensive in order to stand out in a world where everything seems to be moving too fast in the other direction. Well, this is what Kierkegaard suggests, right? He asks, what's a poet? We might say, what's an existential philosopher? An unhappy person who hides deep anguish in their heart, but whose lips are so formed that when the sigh and cry pass through them, it sounds like lovely music. Well, we also find this, again, going to the poet Atticus, misery at least makes good art. My question, though, is, does it make for good teachers? Does it make for better days? And does it make for productive social relationships? Now, my hunch is that it might not. So how then are we going to move forward? I want to offer the following suggestion in light of those possible ways to make sense of some of this seeming depressive misery that we often find in these texts, even if, like I say to my Facebook friends, I'm not suggesting that these are miserable people, right? I'm trying to interrogate this cultural reality. Here's my thought. The very cultural assumptions, the social norms that we just take for granted in our world make philosophical existence very difficult. And it does so precisely because that our reflection, when existentially anchored, challenges those norms. And I want to suggest that one way, not the only, but one way to kind of enter that is to think about what we often talk about as STEM priorities in our culture and our higher education institutions. STEM, of course, right? Science, technology, engineering, math, all amazingly important, necessary. Thank God for vaccines and thank scientists for developing them. Just got my 4th COVID booster 2 days ago. So this is not a critique of science. However, when we take STEM as a cultural norm, I think we've got to add a B at the end of it, which is, I want to say, a business logic. The STEM priorities rise to cultural prominence internal to a scientistic culture where business outcomes, profit margins, marketability becomes why we can be excited about STEM, is because its outcomes are things that can be sold more easily than the things that happen in the humanities. So this STEM cultural assumption is what I think we find attacked and critiqued so well by the French phenomenologist Michel Henry, an existential philosopher, even if not an existentialist. So what he argues in a book called La Barbarie, Barbarism, he says, culture is being lost. We're losing it. We're entering a barbaric space. And he says it's because culture is about life. But life here is not a science idea. It's not biology, but it's affectivity. It's the way we feel the living of our own lived experience. And so scientism, note, not science, right? Scientism as a value set erases subjectivity in favor of that which can be made standardized, objective, packaged, repeated, and sold. So as he puts it, Galilean modernity can no longer offer anything but the terrifying spectacle unfolding right before our eyes, the progressive dismantling of what gives life its meaning. And then later on, he offers what he calls a satanic vow as a value proposition within this space. And he says, everything that can be done in the blind world of things must be done without any further consideration, except maybe that of profit. So he's highlighting the book that I'm adding to STEM book, right? It's the business logic that is actually creating the STEM priorities as scientistic, not just important, necessary, life-giving science. And here, notice the passages I've highlighted. He says, basically, in this objectivist modernity, we are tearing the human being away from ourselves. We are prohibiting free thought and democracy. And love gets reduced to an objective movement of bodies and photos. The way I would summarize his argument, selfhood today matters only if we can make it compelling on Instagram. If it can, again, be packaged, shared, sold, expressed, and ultimately reduced in a way that no longer allows it to be affectively transformative. It's replaceable. It's interchangeable. But this is what leads him then to say that the human being has become no different from a thing. We no longer have faces. And so any of you who've read Levinas know when we lose the face, we lose the depth dimension, the moral dignity of the other, and they become one more replaceable cog in a machine geared to reinforce the status quo of the power structure that is benefiting from excluding those very questions about life, meaning, existence in the first place. So if we grant Henri's critique, which I'm granting because I'm persuaded by it, I think that we see some interesting outgrowths, some interesting upshots. Barbarism, a culture where we have lost culture, minimizes what Aaron James calls asshole dampening systems, because we normalize the very stuff that we should have been opposing as undermining human flourishing. And an asshole for Aaron James is someone who claims systematic special entitlement and minimizes criticism of such behavior. So rather than looking at somebody and saying, no, that's not a way to live, you're dismantling human relationality. You're not seeing faces. You've made people into things. That person just somehow gets to say, hey, it's what it takes to be successful, right? Hate the player, not the game. I mean, hate the game, not the player. Like, this whole idea is precisely what asshole dampening systems should oppose, like democracy, like free speech, like critical engagement, like self-reflection. These sorts of moves are the very things that should be standing against this operation of power that supports assholes. But unfortunately, all of those things are becoming integrated into it and just reinforcing the very behavior we should be rejecting. And this then leads to a rise in bullshit, as Harry Frankfurt says, where we no longer care about truth, we care about persuasion internal to our own interests. So if we find ourselves in a world of barbarous asshole bullshit, this does not look good for existential reflection, right? When truth and goodness and beauty are all seen as things that get in the way of successfully navigating the real world, we end up necessarily seeing existential reflection, existential philosophy, the humanities more broadly, culture creation as an obstacle, a challenge, something to be diminished rather than celebrated as cultivating the culture that makes life possible in the first place. So this makes self-awareness quite costly. If you are going to college, you're heading out into the world, you are taught to take for granted the obviousness of that culture as the real world. It's just the way things are, rather than being invited to see that world as constructed, framed, and deeply relevant to the possibilities of how we narrate our own hopes. This is why I take someone like David Foster Wallace, who says the obvious things in life are of life and death importance, to be the philosopher for our time. As he puts it, right, tells the story of the fish, two young fish swimming along, see the old fish. The old fish says, hey, boy, how's the water? And they look at each other and say, what the hell's water, right? For Wallace, the whole point is this is water, everything we navigate. It's the stuff that we're taking for granted. So I want to suggest that if we become philosophers, regardless of our jobs, regardless of our careers, we begin to pay attention and put question marks where everybody else puts periods. And in doing that, I think we can now re-engage, rethink existential philosophical approaches as resources for joy, resources for hope, rather than reasons not to invite the existential kids to our parties. So how do we do this? Well, first, we've got to realize that honesty about the human condition is itself a necessary aspect of existential philosophy. So those dark topics that Sartre says that they're accused of engaging, well, it's not that they're dark. They're just the kinds of things that we often want to ignore. Despair, anxiety, frustration, boredom, loss, grief. These are real. And so making sure that when we get into existential philosophy, we're not trying to cover over those aspects and put rose-colored glasses on about life is crucial to paying attention to who we are, where we are, and how we are. So as Atticus, again, the poet that has really been speaking to me a lot lately, says, it's good to be with someone who's been through hell. Life's hard and strange, and a lot of shit happens. And when someone's already been through the worst of it already, pain doesn't come as much of a surprise. They just sit down, tie their shoelaces, wave to old demons, and get on with it. I think that's more what existential philosophers confront us as. People tying their shoelaces and moving forward. But it looks miserable because we don't know how to navigate what they're doing as relevant to where we are. We think it's a distraction from the job I've got to go work, from the success I've got to achieve, from the accomplishments and the rat race that I've got to give my whole life. This is also something Anne Lamott notes when she says, why have some of us felt like jumping off tall buildings ever since we can remember? Even those of us who do not struggle with clinical depression? Why have we repeatedly imagined turning the wheels of our cars into oncoming trucks? We just do. To me, this is very natural. It's hard here. This is also why Frantz Fanon says we revolt simply because for many reasons we can no longer breathe. Of course, a phrase that takes on deep, deep, tragic relevance in our own world. So when we take seriously the idea of noting the realities of the human condition that cause us to require criticism of the way our world looks, we begin to recognize that this turning to what's honest about these darker sides of human existence is not about just being miserable, but it's about recognizing that life is more than we have been told. That to be really critical, we've got to be hopeful. Critique is based on hope. When Fanon says we can't breathe, the whole point is there is a possible world where we could overturn the power structures of whiteness and transform the way we narrate human dignity. So in order to take that seriously, we've got to recognize that it's not just being honest about the human condition and seeing all this dark stuff, it's also seeing all of the light. Love, desire, longing, grace, kindness, these are also parts of what it means to be in our existential condition. And so in order to make sure that we are knowing what this looks like, for me, man, in the midst of the pandemic, when we were terrified in early 2020 and everything was collapsing and our society was grounding to a halt, I'm not quite sure where the philosophers were, but wow, just people got on their balconies in France and Italy, across the world, and sung to each other, played music to each other. There's something about this that speaks to what the existential philosophers have always been trying to highlight. That freedom in the face of despair is not a negative thing, it's in fact invigorating. That recognizing our vulnerability in light of finitude means that we have the capacity today to be transformative. So I think we end up with a broad existential value theory. Freedom is grounded in relational existence. This is my Levinasianism. Humility is occasioned by finite embodiment. This is my Kierkegaardianism. Vulnerability and the unmanageable are part of the human condition. Decision is always something that involves risk. Responsibility is inescapable. And then these last two are where I want to kind of dive in as we move to the end here. Hope is openness to possibility. And joy is awareness of meaning making as a matter of faithfulness. So let's unpack those slightly. Jean-Louis Chrétien suggests that instead of thinking about hope as just hoping for something that's possible that we can see how to get to, that hope dissociates itself from all calculation. This is a radical challenge to the barbaric society that would say everything is calculable relative to a scientific value set. Everything is narrated relative to an economic logic of outcomes. And he says, so we should stop thinking that hope is just about what's possible and start hoping for the unhoped for. And the unhoped for transcends our expectations, right? And that's why he says it goes together with the thought of humility. When we hope for the unhoped for, we are envisioning, like Martin Luther King, a world for which now we see no direct path. But the dream remains, and that dream can maybe make possible a different real world. As Anne Lamott puts it, love is why we have hope. But that means we've got to be willing to change things. And that's, I think, where Cornel West speaks so profoundly by saying justice is what love looks like in public. Hope is what makes justice something that we strive toward. So what would joy then be? Here I want to draw on Kierkegaard from his discourse on the lily and the bird. And he says, no one teaches joy better than one who is joyful oneself. The teacher of joy has nothing else to do but be joy. What is joy then? What does it mean to be joy? It's to be truly present, to be today. And this is such a cool idea because this presentist notion is one that Kierkegaard says if we fully find ourselves there, it allows us now not to be overrun by the weight of finitude. This is the answer I gave my son last night. Why does it matter? Even if we're going to die? Because we're not dead today, right? And that idea is what then allows us to reappreciate, to think differently about the very world we find ourselves in. Notice this passage. It's one that doesn't get enough traction, I think, in Kierkegaardian studies. Why joy? That you came into existence, that you exist, that today you receive what's necessary for life, that you came into existence, that you became a human being, that you can see. Bear in mind that you can see, you can hear, you can smell, you can taste, you can feel. The sun shines for you and your sake, right? And then he goes on and talks about the winter coming and the fall coming and the spring coming, and all of it shows up in order to give you joy. Now, notice his account here is deeply rooted in what Henri will call affect. It's the affective living, that we are feeling ourselves alive. But also notice the ableism, that we can see, we can hear, we can taste. But this is something I think that's really cool. Remember, critique matters. We can say, Kierkegaard, what an amazing passage, but we also now can appreciate the way that this can actually be excluding to certain types of bodies. We can do that because joy is possible, and we recognize that sometimes our discourse, our practices, our behaviors minimizes joy for others. Critique is only offered in light of joy and hope as realities. So where then do we go from here? Well, here's kind of what I want to suggest. Existentialists aren't miserable. I mean, some of them individually might have been, but they're simply out of step with a society trained to ignore its misery in order to maximize its profits. Existential philosophy, I suggest, is directed by a logic of faithfulness. It's about who we are becoming, joy and hope, not a logic of success. What can you check off? What can you prove to others? What can you say that you have achieved? And so if we understand that faithfulness task, then I think we can say to our university marketing officers and our admissions officers, look, existential philosophy is useful, but it's useful not because it gets us jobs, though, again, we could talk about the fact that it really kind of does in all sorts of practical ways. But it's useful because it refuses escapism. It reminds us that there is no real world out there. There is a world that someone chose to make real, and that is a task we have to walk into. So maybe Nietzsche's idea of human all too human is not a lament. Maybe it's a call. Be human on purpose. Maybe Sartre's dark side is not a reason for despair, but about simple awareness that honesty is what makes possible not only an awareness of grief, but also an awareness of joy. Maybe Beauvoir's ambiguity and Wei's affliction are not reasons for frustration, but reasons to live on purpose. If we read it that way, then the question we're faced with is, so how do we live like a post-Kantian, an existentialist in public? And I think that the way we do this is ask ourselves some questions. These are some of my books. While you're writing your books, what are you doing for the sake of joy? How are you yourself today joy? How are you being joy today? How is hope narrating why you're writing the books you write? And my suggestion is not that we stop writing books, but maybe we relate to why we write them, not just to get tenure, not just to achieve the success logic that we've inherited, but we do it because we are alive, we are here, we became human beings, and it matters to do that, inviting others to think with us. Here's what I do for joy. I mountain bike, I hang out with my son, I fish with my dad, who is 80 and has cancer currently. And so being able to spend time with him and my son and my wife and my mom, all of this has a different kind of prescience right this second. And I sit on mountaintops every chance I get. I hold office hours often while sitting on top of a mountaintop and Zooming with my students. because finding a different way to navigate what we've always done and knew was important is something we all should be able to find ways to do that fit us. As Atticus puts it, you'll find that most of life's toughest and most existential questions can be solved or indefinitely postponed by simply spending more time around the people you love. So I want to say that existential philosophy helps us realize we need to be affectively and faithfully engaged in doing what brings us joy. It inspires us to hope. And in doing this, we maybe will model the lives that we want to write books about. So let's go surfing with Sartre, as Aaron James suggests. Let's go hiking with Nietzsche, like John Cage offers. Let's go backpacking with the saints, like Belden Lane. And maybe even get beguiled by beauty, as Wendy Farley contends. And my most recent book, which I am currently finishing up, which this talk has basically been the large argument of, maybe we need to go camping with Kierkegaard. Because maybe we need to understand faithfulness as a way of life makes that mountain biking and fishing or sitting at the beach or drinking coffee or taking a walk or watching a good movie, whatever it is that is joy inducing and hope inspiring for you, maybe that should count as research rather than just a distraction from it. If only Kierkegaard had gotten married, if only Nietzsche had made more friends, if only Vey had been easier going, if only Hamlet could have gotten some therapy, if only Sartre could have taken himself a little bit less seriously, who knows what would have happened? They didn't do that, but we might be able to. So when we are faced with Camus' claim that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, I agree. But I've got lots of friends who say, no, that's precisely what narrates our misery and we need to attend to it and change the world. My point is, if we imagine Sisyphus happy, we can start realizing that happiness is possible wherever we are. Nonetheless, critique and change is something that remains a task. We can be joyful while engaging in criticism. We can be hopeful while speaking truth to power. And if we do this, maybe we will model the lives that we have reflected on for so long. And that, I think, leads us to understand philosophy as it's always been. It's a transformative practice. And if we understand it as a transformative practice, we don't have to say, why are existentialists so miserable? We can say, I want to go to the parties where they are, because they're the people who help me be more present, more engaged, and also stand for the justice that is so often lacking. Thank you all so much. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aaron. So the format is typically anyone who is at Woolf will ask questions first, and then I open the forum to anybody who might be interested. But because I'm not quite sure whether anyone from Woolf is here, I'm just going to open it up straight away. So I don't really have a heavy moderator hand, so just unmute yourself, announce your presence, tell us who you are, and then just go ahead and have a discussion.
Sounds good.
Can I make a couple of observations, please? My name's Tim Hull.
Hey, Tim. Sounds great.
Hi. A couple of observations. First of all, this is a very English observation. It wasn't really the kind of philosophical seminar I was expecting. It did sound like a sermon. I must admit, probably one of the best sermons I've heard for a long while, but did sound a bit like a sermon. So just one observation. The other thing is that it felt as if two worlds were colliding. So you had the kind of existentialist philosophical world, and you had the economic, materialist, scientific world were colliding. And I just wondered, often when you talk to these people who adopt that it's all economics, it's all success, it's all science, I wonder if often you meet a kind of performative contradiction in these people. So at one level they're telling you that, but at another level you spot a taste for authenticity, a desire for genuine relationship, all kinds of things. I mean, I had an interesting instance of this. I was hearing Brian Eno talk. We have a festival called Greenbelt in the UK, and I was hearing him being interviewed. And at one hand, we were just about to have Dawkins come and speak, and he was a great fan of Dawkins. He was all into Dawkins' kind of materialistic reductionism. And on the other hand, he was telling us all about how he absolutely loves the gospel music, and he goes to gospel services just for the music. And I'm thinking, hold on a minute, it's a huge performative contradiction here. Someone needs to get their head and their heart together. So can you not, rather than seeing a clash of two worlds, can you actually not see lots of performative contradiction in one of those worlds that actually points towards the other one? By the way, you know, we're not criticizing that it sounded like a sermon. It just wasn't what I was expecting. And, if all the sermons I heard were like that, I'd be going to church more often.
I appreciate that, Tim. Thank you so much. No, though I would balk along with Kierkegaard at the idea of sermon, just because I am decidedly not a theologian. I do take seriously the idea that finding ways to make philosophy invitational might require that we do things a little differently sometimes. And so, to be honest with you, because I knew this is going up on YouTube, this is something that, you know, is available more broadly. I don't get to control the audience by those people who paid their membership dues to the professional society to be in the room. That's kind of what, you know, changed some of that audience, right? And so it
was very creative. I loved it. Creativity of it all. It was great.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, but it was intentional, I guess, is my point, right?
Yeah.
And that said, no, I think you're actually hitting on exactly the right tension between the existentialist and the economic, we might say, worldviews. And I think that maybe the best strategy for unpacking some of that when we're engaging people in the world is precisely to do what you're pointing at. It's not to tell them you're wrong, this is nonsense, but to actually draw out in them the things about which their loves, their joys, their hopes, their experiences that already are kind of at odds with the value theory into which their lives continue to live. And this is something that happens a lot. I before the pandemic, was doing a lot of corporate consulting and business speaking. And so I would speak to rooms, you know, ostensibly defined by that economic mindset. And I would go in, for example, and give a talk about Augustine and simply say, we are what we desire. And then think with them about what are their desires as a company. What is it that they genuinely want to make happen? And then I would kind of flip the script and say, but what are your desires as humans, as individuals, as members of a community? And those desires almost always were radically separate. And so then inviting them to say, what if we could somehow rethink what we do in our businesses, right? I'm not opposed to economic flourishing. I was charging them to give the talk, but being able to think about maybe we could do this differently because it's non-obvious. It's not necessary the way we do it. We could rethink this. And that's the thing that I think they are often very receptive to, regardless of their background or their relationships, because we all like the idea of not being trapped. And so I'm with you. What I would do is invite that friend to go see some gospel music, because the conversation after the performance is likely to be the best conversation that he and I would ever have together, because we've now framed it in the affect of a shared experience that we're both now human to human engaging, rather than having to speak only internal to these broad, abstract ideological frames of reference. So I absolutely support what you're saying and think that's the strategy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Others?
I'm going to ask I'll jump in. I want to ask a question about camping with Kierkegaard. So one of my suspicions might be that you know, in the late night hour around the campfire or something, that a lot of that trip might involve a sort of, I guess, what scripture would call burden bearing, right? So one thing you've talked about is just that listening ear, that process of kind of you know, bearing burdens, or just being that kind of sounding board that doesn't have the advice or rushes in with a quick quote or brightness or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Could you describe just that tension of philosophy's role as a sort of listening ear first and primarily, maybe? I mean, obviously you present a lot of constructive things here. I think that camping with Kierkegaard in some ways would actually be an exercise in some of that, in that in reading him, we all kind of are his listening ear throughout time, right? For the next 200 years or whatever it would be. Can you talk about just that role of navigating, that listening and also advice, even in maybe your son, for example, asking big questions?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So one of the things, a couple years ago, I had the honor of co-directing a dissertation of an amazingly talented and innovative young scholar named Amber Bowen. And she wrote a dissertation on Kierkegaard and new phenomenology. And as we were working through it, at one point I was thinking with her and I said, what would it look like if we started changing our metaphors of sight to hearing? Right? Where instead of seeing something to be true, or we can see in Kierkegaard, we start talking about, listen to what Kierkegaard says here, or how is it we can hear this differently? And of course, as a professional musician myself, right, the idea of developing one's ear to hear things that others miss is actually something that I think is not just a musical talent, it's maybe a human talent or a philosophical talent. And so I'm entirely with you when it comes to the importance of listening, importance of hearing. It's tricky as philosophers, because we often, I think, misunderstand the Socratic method as a sort of, I already know where we're going to go, but I'm going to let you think that you're taking us there, right? Rather than actually being spontaneously open to the idea of being disrupted by a question that you might not have expected. So when my son says, what's the point? And I gave him this kind of, Kierkegaardian response. I didn't quote Kierkegaard, right? Which I think is probably unhelpful. Well, son, if you'd only read without authority, you'd see. But I was like, look, man, it matters that we're here. Do you enjoy playing tag with your friends? Do you enjoy playing xylophone in the marching band? Do you enjoy, he has a new Orbeez gun that shoots these little like Jello balls at his father most of the day when I walk outside? He's like, do you enjoy? He's like, yeah, it's freaking awesome. And I was like, so maybe that's enough, right? Maybe that's enough of an answer, Atticus. And he then responds, he's like, yeah, I get that. And he said, but it still all seems really meaningless in the long run, which is exactly the right response, right? Like, nah, presentism doesn't work, Dad. There's got to be some sort of lasting significance. Now, he doesn't have the vocabulary to articulate it that way, but we do. So being able to open ourselves up to the idea that when we're sitting around the campfire or hanging out after the gospel choir or enjoying, a really good microbrew or coffee or whatever it is, taking a walk, what we're doing is inviting others to realize that their voice matters, right? Part of seeing the face of the other doesn't mean solving their problem. Now, that's certainly important, right? I'm a progressive. I stand for the importance of justice being part of our lived reality. But sometimes it's just teaching them that their voice matters, and it doesn't have to require a response from me. That I'm invested in hearing them think it through, and maybe that also is enough, right? So I will say, in the Camping with Kierkegaard book, it's funny, the very same people who were telling me, oh, how lazy of you, existentialists aren't miserable, this is such a sloppy straw man, are also the people saying, God, like, what a miserable dude to take camping with. Like, I'd never want to go camping with that guy, right? So they also kind of get the fact that these are not just happy people often. And so my point about camping with Kierkegaard, I think actually camping with Soren would probably suck, like as an actual other human. But man, I would love to go camping with my friends and my family in ways that then, understanding the invitation Kierkegaard offers us about what it looks like to live faithfully, are now put in practice around the campfire, while chopping wood, while taking a hike, while setting the tent, while dodging the rain, while, scaring away a bear. That all of this is nested in vulnerability, but it's also something that matters right here and now, and maybe, to my son, even matters eternally. And this, for what it's worth, and to Tim, I can get technical for 1 second. This is where I would actually think Kierkegaard's notion of the instant, where eternity and time meet, that this is actually a robust resource for thinking about the eternal significance of passing, fleeting, finite particularities. So we've got resources to do this work. I just think if we restrict ourselves only to writing super technical books about what this resource looks like, maybe we've actually abdicated the whole point. It's kind of like, I don't know if any of you have had this. This is a lazy straw man. When I was in grad school, the joke was, what's the difference in analytic and continental philosophy? Analytic philosophy is super relevant, but irrelevant to life. I mean, it's super rigorous, super rigorous, but irrelevant to life. And continental philosophy, super relevant to life, but unreadable, right? And like, I think both of those are false. Most of my analytic friends are writing stuff that is existentially just, groundbreaking. But it's often really clear, but it's also often clear in argumentative form that doesn't sound the way we talk very often. But you know what definitely doesn't sound the way we talk? Heidegger and Deleuze, right? Like, so finding not a way to abdicate our responsibility to be rigorous experts in technical vocabularies. We got to do that. But doing that so that we can also say, jamming with the jazz musicians in my garage and all of us geeking out about the chord progressions and the 11/8 time signature. I also need to be able to be a drummer who can make people nod their head and clap, because that's what's going to make the experience of the concert something that lets the conversation with Tim afterwards probably be better. So that's a weird answer. That's what I get. Yeah, James, I think, has a hand up.
Hi there. My name's James, and
Hey, James.
I'm not a philosopher. So this question might be overly broad, so take it where you will. But when you mentioned your thoughts about the focus of STEM, and the sort of the prevailing sort of ideology of the age, as sort of being opposed to sort of what the existential thought might be. I was wondering if you could probably just sort of speak a bit more to that in regard to ideas of like modernity and subjectivity and going to postmodernism and sort of where existential thought leads within that. That's a very broad question.
Yeah.
And I don't have a whole lot of understanding of how to sort of piece that together. I just listen to a lot of interesting podcasts.
Yeah, no. Well, James, thank you so much for being here. It is important that we not only become philosophers who can speak to broader audiences, but that we give talks that broader audiences find worth listening to. So I think you're being here. I hope this was something that you enjoyed and can engage. So in very brief, all too brief a way, let me put it this way. If we think of the rise of the Enlightenment, Henri locates it as the rise of Galileo in particular. Part of what happens is a really important development in at least Western human history, which is we become very committed to the relevance of evidence as motivating particular types of public behavior and action. And we might say, well, we were always concerned with evidence. Socrates asked about evidence. But part of the difference we find here is that what's going on is this evidence has to be repeatable, shareable, and radically non-subjectively viable. In other words, it's not about you. It's not about you as scientist. It's about the data science as this abstract idea produces that allows us then as cogs in a human machine to be able to draw on it in the right sorts of ways to yield the right kind of outcomes. Now, this is remarkably valuable for the advancements of all kinds of things in human history, right? We get all sorts of results, not just from medicine, but technology. We, in many ways, this creates the possibility for a different and expanded notion of leisure that becomes possible now because we're able to streamline and make efficiency something that we can navigate. So there is no critique of science in this. And I think Henri should have even been a little bit more pronounced about that. The critique is not, oh, that darn Galileo or those crazy Enlightenment rationalists. It's a matter of saying, when we open that door, it now can look like this evidential model of objective, repeatable, output-driven life is now the only value theory that we need for human existence. And that's where we go from important science to dangerous scientism. And scientism is simply the idea that the only meaningful questions are those that can be answered internal to this methodological form. But notice what drops out. Well, for Henri, culture drops out, namely art, ethics, and religion, right? So the things that were stimulated from our human experience now get reducible to repeatable internal to an algorithmic model of calculative thinking. And philosophers across, lots of decades and centuries have railed against this. We see Heidegger's critique of technology and the way that it reduces us to simply, machine standing reserve, he says. We see Husserl being critical of the European science because he basically says, look, we've lost our humanity in the process of becoming objective data crunchers. We see this in Henri, who's basically just reviving both of those critiques and deploying it in a slightly more phenomenologically lived way. But it's also the case that this is something we also see as it then plays out relative to the task of the university. And this is where the buh, I think, is very visible, right? So there's lots, again, ways we can go. I'm just trying to give you one through line. So universities traditionally, higher education traditionally, has been a site of culture creation. And culture creation, we mean art, ethics, religion, you're doing the stuff. And I would say science as part of that culture creation, right? Really good science is tantamount to really good art and ethics and religious exist. Like it's all part of this. And the university was where we created the culture that then the world navigated and lived into or rejected in various ways. But think about where we are now. Universities are not sites of culture creation. They are centers of culture reflection, because we're not now articulating what ought to be the case about the world and then making arguments for it. We're simply bringing in business leaders to sit on the boards and tell us how we should run our programs so that we can produce the employees that they want to hire. But notice that then takes the university out of the job of inviting persons and selfhood as a cultural product, and instead puts us in the game of making employees as the only definitional distinction for what persons who matter are. This is where we then narrate our dignity in terms of our bank accounts, and we navigate our humanity in terms of how many followers we have, right? So postmodernity saying, but all of it's contingent. Right? I'm a postmodern metaphysical realist. So again, there's lots of depth we could get in here. And Tim and I can geek out about these things if we want. But the idea is, it's not saying there is no real in some deep sense. It's just saying all of our social existence, the real world that we keep training students to enter, postmodernity helps us recognize, no, that's a world we create every single instant that we tell the students what it looks like to be relevant to it. Right? So that buh at the end of STEM is, I'm suggesting the real narrative now is not just that we are scientifically arranged, but that our scientism has now become marketed as the very task of the university itself. And the cost of this is we end up in a world where we're unable to make sense of what it even looks like to navigate anyone with whom we disagree, because we've narrated assholes as just what business leading looks like. That's just what success involves. And then we're comfortable with bullshit because we said truth. What a waste of time. Can you be an influencer even if you don't know anything about what you're talking about? Like, notice we've allowed the very transformation of all the things that were really so valuable about the rise of science, which we should all be very excited about. I like electric and indoor plumbing. We couldn't do this talk except for all of those Galilean modernities. But then we sold the farm. And that's where I think Henri diagnoses it so well. And then we can maybe, in light of that diagnosis, go back and look for different types of, to extend the medical analogy, different types of antibiotics for this disease that we find in Kierkegaard and Chrétien and Beauvoir and Cornel West and on and on and on. They now speak maybe a little differently because, to David's point, maybe we can develop slightly different ears to hear. Right. Thank you so much for that question.
James, if you have something you want to say in response, it's great. And I see a hand from Michael as well. So at some point, I think Michael wants to jump in.
Sounds good.
What I would say in response, like I appreciate that of just sort of keeping us sort of within the plane of business within a sort of a scientific model in which our definition and our goal shifts over time based on what we're all that.
Mhm.
Yeah, just I thought that was great. You don't have to go much farther with this, but like, just I don't know, like I'm trying to connect these dots from sort of modernity to like where we are in sort of a crisis of meaning in the real right now, because you're just like, oh, we're selling it off. We sold the farm kind of thing. And wondering where like the existential lens above the phenomenological or the postmodern, or is feeding into both, like where that squares into all of that.
Yeah, I mean, let me maybe say this, see if it helps just real quickly. Nothing I'm saying, again, is a critique of science, and nothing I'm saying is ultimately a critique of business. It's about a value set that then becomes reductively unitary, right? That's the thing I'm worried about. I actually am a big fan of philosophers being more engaged in the business world, because I actually think, again, wouldn't it be great if instead of just listening to them to tell us how to do our classes, we could actually be somebody who speak with them about how they run businesses, right? It seems to me like that's a productive move. Back to Tim's point, like that's that cognitive dissonance we can actually engage in really cool ways, right? So I think in making those moves, one of the things that we can actually do is then say, but what if we rethought some of these big ideas? So for example, we often think about things like entrepreneurship, innovation being these big, kind of buzzwords at university. I'm all in on that. But why is it we tend to think about that so often as just what it looks like to have a startup, right? Where the goal is to exit a billionaire. What if we started thinking about, and I do this like in my hip hop classes, what if we started thinking about the idea of entrepreneurship looking like changing a whole field via poetic engagement, like somebody, like KRS-One was doing, like Grandmaster Flash was doing, rethinking what I've been offered and making something new out of it. It doesn't have to be always then tied directly to it's about getting the paper, right? But there's nothing wrong with making money. It's important to remember that Kierkegaard has this great line where he says the knight of faith ends up being unrecognizable because it looks like a tax collector. So we've got to be careful. Those of us like myself who are very progressive politically can often start thinking the goal is for all of us to look this other way, right? It's like, I don't know. I'm with Aaron James where he says the goal is not to erase capitalism necessarily, right? But to rethink how can human flourishing be the goal rather than profit be the goal. And maybe we can do that internal to capitalism. Maybe there's other ways forward, right? I'm not an economic theorist, so I don't know. But the idea is I just don't want you to walk away thinking it's this kind of, typical, leftist critique of all of these things, rather than understanding it as an invitation to rethink the very things about which we then engage as leftists or not, right? So thanks again, James. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think Michael has a question.
Hey, Aaron, thank you so much for your talk.
Thanks for
I'm,
being here.
by the way, a philosophy grad student at Fordham.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, and I met Amber briefly in Copenhagen this summer. Just ran into her.
She's fantastic. You
So
are better for having met her.
Yeah. So thank you for your talk. I had a question, sort of related actually to the figure that they were discussing at the last Woolf seminar, Lukestrup, who I'm sure name you've heard.
Yep.
One of the things that he focuses on, which I hear a little bit of in your talk today, is activities of absorption with the ones we love, or the way like being in the presence of others we love draws us out of our kind of internal turned inness on ourselves. And so that seemed like one thing you were sort of recommending as a positive thing to shoot for. And it strikes me that those kinds of experiences, like Atticus is saying, spending time with the ones we love, pull us out of reflection, like pull us out
that's
of
interesting.
critical engagement, or like critical undermining of what's going on. And you seem to also be recommending that a big role for philosophy is to help us question the status quo. So I'm wondering, that feels a little bit like a tension in your talk. Like, can you do both of those with existential philosophy, or does Kierkegaard, like Lukestrup claims, kind of keep us away from that kind of absorption?
Yeah, no, this is such a good question, and I really appreciate kind of making it so pointed. So there's a political philosopher, a good friend of mine named Robert Talese, who has written a couple books recently that I highly recommend. The first is called Overdoing Democracy, and then the follow-up was called Sustaining Democracy. And he's got a third coming out as well, kind of a trilogy. And what he argues, I think, is actually relevant to what you're saying. His argument, in very brief, runs like this. Part of why we are critically unable to respond to the particular crises that we're facing in our democratic institutions right now is everything is political. Right? There's never a time that we get away from the political weight of having to navigate and narrate our lives as left or right, Republican, Democrat, et cetera. Again, in Britain right now, Tim, obviously, different categories, but the same questions, right? And what Talese suggests is, well, how is it that we're going to respond to this crisis, right? The real threat of democracy failing in the face of our radical division. And a political theorist, Talese, does not recommend what we should do is get better at politics, right? Now, he does lots of diagnostics that I highly recommend. It's fantastic stuff about how polarization works and how it ends up functioning relative to hermeneutic narrowness and extremism. It's brilliant stuff. But his overall recommendation is this: go bowling, join a church softball club, right? Like, his recommendation is find ways to be with people that are not necessarily requiring the narrative of the political frame as the condition for entry. Now, you might say, yeah, but isn't that just abandoning the importance of this really serious work? And his point is, no. The best way we can become people able to engage in the complicated conversation back around the dinner table, at the coffee shop, at the public civic event, is because we now see the other person as the person who got that home run off me last week, not just the enemy who's ruining my country, right? Now, I recognize, and I always feel like that there's just so much qualifying we have to do. I don't know if any of you are fans of the rapper Open Mike Eagle, but he's got a song called Qualifiers. And it always makes me think like what it's like talking to philosophers. This is the greatest idea, maybe. This is going to be a wonderful suggestion, probably. If only we can kind of accept what I'm saying. So we end up qualifying, but I do want to add a qualifier that says, none of this, hey, just go play softball, is going to end racism or overcome white nationalism or get rid of conspiracy theories, right? But what it might do is help us realize, well, what we're doing now doesn't seem to be working, right? So, punching each other on Facebook or, God forbid, in real life, that doesn't seem to be helping. All of the, again, it's an American specific point, all of the data and the hearings and the public discourse about the January 6th attempted coup at the Capitol, you'd think surely that has changed public opinions. The answer is nope. The data is nearly identical relative to those who are supporting Trump and those who are opposing Trump, those who think he's guilty of a crime, those who think he's not. It basically hadn't moved. So the idea that we just need to do more philosophy, quote unquote, in kind of explicit ways, I actually think there's a, kind of worry about that. So my suggestion of, I get, Tim's point, it sounds kind of sermon-esque. Can't we all just get along? Let's just go camping together. I get why that can seem a little bit passé and almost like naive and ignorant and just dripping with privilege. But my thought is, well, shoot, look at lots of the big social movements that have happened in history. In an awful lot of them, we had these deep moral commitments about the humanity of other people. But it wasn't that transformed our behavior. It was the fact that that person who's on the other side or is being victim is also somebody who's friends with my kid, right? Or they, have been at that same farmer's market with me or whatever it might be. So my suggestion is not that we see these at odds, but we see the idea of, going to Thanksgiving and not talking politics with grandma is not abdicating the critical reflective engagement, but actually making us the type of people who understand how to do critical reflection in ways that are not just more facilitating the very division, the very polarization that we really have to find a way not to do. So I don't know if that's an answer, but I do think that we have some really cool models in contemporary political theory showing us how doing the thing that looks like a distraction from the critical work might make us better at doing the critical work. And my argument has been doing the critical work makes us actually have better reasons for going camping, right? Like they actually feed each other. It's not just that we go camping and maybe something good happens. It's no, I'm riding my bike on purpose as a philosopher right now. Right. And this is why I started a mountain bike club at Furman. I have no idea the political loyalties and allegiances and the majors, but we get together and go ride mountain bikes together. And when we do this, the point is there's a real capacity of transformative engagement. But the reason I'm doing it is not just I like mountain biking. It's because I'm phenomenologically invested in modeling what it looks like to maybe be joy a little bit more, instead of just modeling what it looks like to be a real badass who can walk his way through, Nietzsche's account of whatever. It's like, yeah, I'm going to do that stuff in my classes, I hope. But maybe they'll be more receptive even to those classes because we've also hit the trails together, right? I think they feed each other. What do you think?
That sounds quite plausible to me, I think. And even just models the way life can develop over time. You need those times where you sit down with your wife and say, like, what are we doing? Do we need to make some changes? Right. But you can't be doing that all the time. So I think you can sell a kind of feeding one another.
There's a good reason why people who have kids still find ways to go on date nights, right? And I think it's because that's what in many ways allows them to come back together and navigate what it looks like to do the critical work of parenting. But if all you're doing is the critical work of parenting, like, man, it's pretty hard also to be like, sweethearts, right? Like somehow we've got to be able to do both of these things as we walk life together. And to be honest, I think one of the failures of Levinasian philosophy is, and again, I've written a lot of books on Levinas. I'm a Levinasian deep in my core, but I think one of the problems with Levinas is everything ends up getting raised to such an extreme, right? That at the end of the day, you kind of want to say, yeah, but I get that the other is radically incommensurable and asymmetry goes all the way down and there's never a way I can catch up and I'm never able to evade my opponent. But is it okay to let like somebody who holds the door for me, like, can I say thanks and just walk through it? It's like Derrida when he talks about the impossibility of the gift. David Wood, one of my mentors, once said, maybe it's time to give gifts again. And I actually found that to be a really profound deconstructive point, right? So it's not that we are abandoning or abdicating our philosophical rigor. It's that we need to realize that our rigor, if not at some level, contributing to that public audience and public relevance, it's unclear what we're doing, right? The most rock star narrow immunologist sitting in some lab somewhere, the goal is not to just discover something and be like, oh, that's fascinating. The goal is that then trickles into the vaccine that helps us not die so quick, right? I'm just asking what that trickle looks like for philosophers. And I've given one option of what it might involve. I think there are lots of other views. I think French feminism has done some really cool work, on showing how this translates to global feminist praxis. I think queer theory has done really interesting stuff about transforming how we then navigate human behavior. I think that part of even how we understand the we's and the communities that then form to think about these questions, right? Until Katie, who is a friend of mine, hopped on. This is largely a community of white guys talking about philosophy this morning together, right? Which still a good conversation, but recognizing, hey, not like we then don't need to do it, but how is it we can always be attending to who is this we? Who's playing softball with us? Who's going hiking? Is there a different way to walk with others, and maybe a way that invites other people to walk with us differently, right? And actually, to Tim's point about gospel music, I am a Pentecostal Christian, Tim, so maybe I'm betraying my Pentecostalism in the way I do philosophy. But one of the things that's always interesting to me when it comes to distinctions in predominantly white versus predominantly Black churches here in the States in Pentecostal traditions, it's interesting because lots of the white churches will say, oh, we want to be inclusive, we want to be open to everybody, etc. And then because, I've got some experience working in, some of the predominantly Black churches, I'd say, well, hey, have we thought about being willing to change the way we do what we do and the style we deploy and the different kind of music? Like, why aren't we pulling from gospel music more often? Because maybe there's different familiarities in different communities and different spaces and different backgrounds, namely tapping affect. And boy, that doesn't go well, because then it's like, oh, no, but that's just not what we do. You're like, well, yeah, of course it's not what we do. And then it's not surprising that the we keeps looking like us, right? So there's not a silver bullet to fix any of this stuff. It's all hard and complicated. But being willing to say, as Henri does, not Henri, when Chrétien does, when he says, look, hope is what will throw us into humility. Because when you recognize I have hope for a different real, that means I've got to be humble enough to recognize that if I'm currently benefiting from the way the real world looks, I might need to reevaluate my relationship to it. So challenging, Michael, privilege is not something that then means, abdicating responsibility. It's actually something I think that can go hand in hand with what it looks like to, to David's point, walking humbly before your God, whoever your God is, might involve being willing to say it's less about me. How do I pass the microphone, as Grandmaster Flash would say.
Hey, let me jump in. There's a gardener outside, so if you hear a leaf blower, I apologize. So with an eye to concluding today's discussion, I have a question, but before I ask it, I want to just give a final opportunity for anybody else in the audience who might have comment or a question for Aaron to jump in.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Good. So yeah, wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I mean, you might imagine, given my own philosophical interests being similar to yours, there's so much that you had to say today that, there's so much I could comment on. Kierkegaard, the text that you were homing in on, the Lily and the Bird, is probably my favorite text of his. I think it's just an extraordinary text, and it's a beautiful text. And my question for you, really, it's not a question about the methodological relationship between philosophy and theology. That's something that I know you've done a lot of work in, because the phenomenologists that you were drawing on today, Chrétien, Henri, these are guys that are today sort of associated with what's called the theological turn in phenomenology. But my question for you is with regard to the issue of hope and this problem of death that your son's picking up on, that there's seems to be this kind of ultimate meaninglessness that is still lurking, even if one can be present in the moment and joyful for what that is. I wonder whether you have any sort of kind of concluding remarks about what Kierkegaard in that same text calls joy in the Lord, or for you personally, hope in the resurrection, and how that transforms this question of existential joy, and in what regard, if at all, it changes or influences your practice as a philosopher when you're doing existential philosophy.
No, it's a great question. So yes, as Stephen knows and is being cagey about in charitable ways, he and I disagree fairly strongly about the relation methodologically of philosophy and theology and how this plays out in professional praxis. But we disagree in ways that Stephen always gives me pause and makes me think maybe I'm wrong. And so I appreciate his work pushing me in all of those good directions. This is a fascinating question. So let me answer it in two moves. Let me respond in two moves and hope to not lose the audience in doing so. My first response, and the first thing that jumps to mind whenever I get these sorts of questions that are focusing me more on confessional aspects of my own, public religious identity, right? I'm public about being a Pentecostal Christian, in part because I think Pentecostalism is one of those ideas that is more confusing to people than it is clarifying. It's not something that often people say, oh, I know what that means, right? And so people say, well, what do you mean by that? And it opens a conversation, I think, that's sometimes very productive. But when I identify as a Pentecostal philosophically, and I've written some about this, what I think the philosophical resonance with my Pentecostal spirituality is a focus on an affective epistemology, right? That we know because we feel and live first. It's a focus on the idea that reality is always excessive. It's more than, the way we would put this in Pentecostal is that the pneumatological imagination is one that requires us to see spirited reality as explosive of materialist reductionism. I find that sentence to be kind of as boring as my alternative title to this paper. So what I mean by that is, look, maybe the world is just excessive and more interesting than we possibly could have realized. And ways to talk about that are the world is enchanted, right? But that doesn't necessitate that we now move to some sort of theory of theism. I want to talk about that as an existential point. And what I mean by thinking of this as an existential point is simply to say, often, I would say some of the most compelling quasi-Pentecostal philosophers are thinkers who are not Christian, not even theists, but they are thinkers who invite me to become invested in the more than logic, the excess, the plenitude notion, instead of reduction and scarcity and lack. So if I were to say, so what do I make then of something like the resurrection or the joy of the Lord, which you're right, Kierkegaard explicitly lands the plane there, right? And I quoted passages very strategically to minimize some of that aspect. And in my book, I do the same. I try intentionally to engage all this material without making it something that is landing in, therefore, Christianity or Christian joy, because I think that actually is not where I stand philosophically. So my response would be, well, what is it that the Lord or resurrection, whatever, signifies in an existential sense, regardless of one's commitment or not to it in a confessional sense? And this is where I follow Heidegger, who says Kierkegaard's is most philosophically interesting when he's his most Christian, right? And my response would be this. Joy in the Lord means that joy is not exclusively reducible to my effort. That we're not confusing subjectivity as truth with the idea of just subjectivism as truth. That there is a more than that we could name the Lord, right? In a very confessional sense or a broader existential sense, that requires faithfulness to be something that unfolds in light of genuine mystery. And this is where the idea of openness to the future, I'm an open theist for what it's worth, and I take seriously that the future is radically open. It's not already necessary and already finished. And that openness is very much the kind of openness we see when we get Heidegger saying only a God can save us. He's not literally saying, right, a theistic divine savior will step in and end some sort of human suffering. What he's saying is only in relation to a future so open that we right now could not of our own accord even envision what it would look like is real salvation possible. We have to be so radically open to the more than, to the mystery, to the excess, that we're willing to humble ourselves in the face of the Lord. So there's my existential revisioning of the Kierkegaardian confessionalism. And that's then what makes it perfectly sensible to me. When Sartre says that, you know, his task is to faithfully become an atheist. I want to say, amen, brother Sartre. like I'm with you, because faithfulness for me is risk with direction. It's not belief that P about theism. Risk with direction is existential faith, and that's the faithfulness that I want when I talk about becoming instead of being. So there's my first response. Hopefully is inclusive to all who would want to find existentialism interesting and want to read Kierkegaard without having to think that then the goal of Kierkegaard is a big apologetic for becoming a confessional Christian. As a confessional Christian, or somebody trying to become one, myself, I'm not afraid of saying, yeah, but I do think, and I did say to my son last night, isn't it cool that God created a world that made possible for us real joy, even if that joy is not something that lasts forever? And he was like, what do you mean? It's just gonna be, I was like, man, when you're riding your skateboard, the joy of riding that skateboard was amazing, right? And he's like, yeah, he was dropping in on 5 and 6 foot ramps and feeling really strong about himself. And then he landed wrong and broke his arm. And he now is kind of narrating all of it as horrible and miserable. He hates the skateboard because he hasn't gotten over the trauma of the broken arm. And so I do appeal to God and Jesus and the resurrection to say things like, but Atticus, when Jesus dies on the cross, like that's not something that then ends it, right? As we'd say in the Black churches, a lot of which I attended in my youth, like the goal is he got up, right? The idea is, how does this then pivot into the idea of being able to say the grief and the despair do not have the final word? This is where William Barber, a preacher I listen to regularly, says the great thing about Resurrection Sunday, right, which we tend to call Easter, is, he says, the idea that death does not have the final word. This doesn't have to be just understood relative to soteriology. This can be understood to worldly power structures, to the reality of lived trauma, to the grief that occurs in light of genuine loss. In the midst of human suffering, we can say, but suffering does not get to have the period. There is a question mark that gets positioned. And so in my Christian communities, I narrate that question mark with explicit reference to Jesus. But I don't think philosophically I have to. And that's where, for me, existentialism is this great resource for being able to recognize that different audiences, I can deploy different verbal moves, and it's not disingenuous in either side. I'm not trying to hide anything on either side, but being able to say, this is not a bait and switch. It's not, let's just talk about existential joy. But what I really mean is Jesus, right? But if they say, yeah, but what do you mean? It's like, well, yeah, like I hope God looks like Jesus, because I think it's pretty amazing that the story of the death and resurrection, I don't read as penal substitution. I actually think that that's a horrible theology. I read it as a story about a God so invested in the human condition that nothing we experience was not relationally shared and effectively deployed as part of God's own experience. There's nothing that we could go through that God doesn't say, yeah, I'm with you. And so to David's point, being with someone, well, that's just good Levinasian philosophy, right? But it doesn't have to be cashed out in these Christian ways, though it certainly could for a Christian, and hopefully in ways that then might be critical of some of the dominant majoritarian readings of these very Christian doctrines that I think actually lead to indirect support or sometimes direct support for the very dangerous power structures that I think we should challenge. So I think that being Christian can do it.
Can I just
Tim,
ask,
please.
Stephen, you were saying you disagree with Aaron on this issue. Is there something you've written together, or is there a dialogue I can look at? Because I'm fascinated about that disagreement.
So,
Well,
go ahead.
Aaron and I have known each other now for 4 years, I think. We've only met in person once and had just a kind of brief chance to talk this over in person. We've maintained a bit of a correspondence through email. And then, of course, he and I, we read each other's work. So it's sort of a dialogue through print.
Yeah, and what I would say, Tim, the big difference here, again, it's one of those like family squabbles, right? But it has to do with, and Stephen, correct me if I'm misinterpreting your work, but Stephen tends to be much more willing to allow for a blurrier line between theology and philosophy. And I want a really very rigid line between philosophy and theology that cuts along what I take to be just good Thomistic distinctions relative to the evidence to which one appeals as authoritative. So I define philosophy as the practice of rigorous argumentation that is engaged in a task of truth-seeking, guided by argumentative evidence that is available in principle to all members of the philosophical community, which means my being a Christian cannot then lead me to deploy different types of evidence that other philosophers who are non-Christian couldn't access. I see that as doing theology. But because I respect theology so much, I don't see this as a like, oh, they don't get to play. I see it actually as theology is better when theologians and philosophers can sit at the table together and recognize that their evidential sets are actually different. So I reject the idea that these boundaries are porous. So I, for example, am critical of people like Nick Wolterstorff and Alvin Plantinga on this front in the kind of analytic world. And I'm critical of people like Emmanuel Falk and, you know, Kevin Hart and others on the phenomenological side that tend to kind of get very blurry. And I want to say, no. We need each other, but we need each other appealing to different evidential sets that allow us to say, I am a philosopher or I am a theologian.
I mean, what you're saying sounds like Ricoeur. Ricoeur took a bit similar position.
Yep, that's right. And so if you, in print, the book I edited, Christian Philosophy, I have a chapter in there called The Strategies of Christian Philosophy, where I argue for this view and say there is no such thing as Christian philosophy. There is philosophy that is interested in questions of relevance to historical Christian communities, but I don't know what it means to do Christian philosophy. I know what it means to do philosophy and also be a Christian. And so that strategy I describe as being a bad strategy for those who want to be identified as Christian philosophers. And so
do you think you'll publish something at some point, you and Steve, in this dialogue? Because I think it sounds a fascinating dialogue. I'd love to get into it.
We should.
I was going to jump in there quick. I don't know if you and I will ever co-author something, but there is a piece you published recently with Amber, which I cite in a forthcoming article of mine. You might want to mention that to Tim. What's that called? Where is that? Which journal was that in?
Yeah, so I'm actually, as you're saying that, I have to remind myself.
The one about like
what it takes two things.
It takes two things.
Yeah, it takes two to make a thing go right. We were quoting the old hip hop track. So yeah, it is. Let me see here. I will tell you. It is.
Could you send me a link to it if that's possible?
Yeah, so the title is It Takes Two to Make a Thing Go Right. And it is published now. So I'll actually be happy to. Yeah, if you want to email me, just aaron.simmons@furman.edu, I'll be happy to send you the link to the published version. I actually, to be honest, right this second, I'm forgetting where we even published it.
I think it was, is it Open Theology? Is that the name?
That might, I think that's right. And
Yeah,
so that's awesome because it would be open access. And so I can send you the actual published article. But yeah, there we argue this same point that in phenomenology, we do better if we have philosophers and theologians at the table, but they're not trying to usurp each other's identity. And our analogy is drawn from Merold Westphal, who says that philosophers wear many hats. And we say, yeah, but you don't wear many hats at the same time, right? Like the whole point is I can put a beanie on when it's really cold outside, or I can put a ball cap on when it's really sunny outside. And so I can move between discourses, like I was trying to model about moving between my Christian community or my existential community. I can do this differently without compromising doing them both honestly. What matters is I'm not forgetting which hat I have on relative to which audience regarding the evidential authorities to which I can appeal in legitimate ways.
Yeah, it'd be just nice to hear. It'd be nice to hear this in detail at some point, because I mean, obviously running out of time. But anyway, thanks for.
Please email me. I'll stick my email in the chat, and I will be thrilled to send you the link to the essay. Thank you, Stephen, for reminding me about that.
Thanks for today. It's been great. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you so much for being here.
Okay, well, I think with that said, we'll draw the meeting to a close. Aaron, I want to thank you for just a wonderful talk today and for being a part of the seminar. And I want to thank everybody who took the time to attend. I really appreciate your being here. And as with the last talk, this was recorded. It'll be posted online, so it'll be made available later for others you might know who might want to take a listen. Yeah, and I guess with that, I'll conclude things there. Thank you very much.
Thank
and
you all.
Everybody have a good day.
Bye-bye. Good talk in the forum.
Goodbye.